Before we proceed to tonight's main event, I want to speak a little bit about the Visiting Writers Program, its origins, and what our intention is with this program. It began a number of years ago, before I came to Hillsdale. It's a long time ago, over 25 years. And my former colleague and friend, Dan Sundahl, whom some of you may remember, was the director of the program and put it on a solid foundation. He brought some great writers to campus, and his goal in establishing the program was to try to replicate here at Hillsdale something of what he experienced when he was an undergraduate at Gustavus Adolphus College in Minnesota, where visiting writers would come now and again, and the people who directed that program did everything they could to make sure the writers spent their time with students. Now, you're at Hillsdale, and you may not realize it, but at some places what happens is that the writers come to campus and spend a good deal of their time in parties with faculty members and administrators, and they will see the students at a reading, maybe at a workshop, and that may be about it. And that's the last thing that I want to have happen here. So every chance we get, we try to facilitate opportunities for you, I'm speaking to the students, to meet and get to know the writers that we bring. Dan, as I said, put the program on a superb foundation. He made it so easy for me when I stepped in almost 25 years ago to run this program. In the years since I came, among the writers that we've brought, names that you should know if you don't know them already, include the poets Mark Jarman from Vanderbilt University, Paul Mariani, who was here just a couple of years ago. I think Paul has been here 5 times over the years, now at Boston College in his final semester teaching. Andrew Hudgens at Ohio State, also in his final semester teaching. B.H. Fairchild, whom some of you may remember, was here not that long ago. And among other writers, Ron Hansen from Santa Clara University, Jim Shepard from Williams College, Tony Early from Vanderbilt, John Jeremiah Sullivan from Wilmington, North Carolina, and a former student of our guest this week. One of the things that has been true of all of these visitors is how generous they have been with their time with our students. I was just talking to Mark the other night over dinner, and just a regular old conversation, and I said I've been reading a book of short stories, a collection of stories by Joy Williams, and then whose work I had not read before, but she's fantastic. And Mark said, oh, I used to stay with her and her husband when I would visit New York. Oh, that's impressive to me. And later I think I was mentioning Eudora Welty, one of my heroes, great writer from Mississippi. Had the misfortune of being from the state that also produced Faulkner, but a powerhouse in her own right. And Mark said, oh, I once interviewed her for the BBC at her home in Jackson, Mississippi. Had a great story about how she would end an interview by appearing to levitate, as I'm sure she could do, because she could do so much. And then he was talking to me about how John Sullivan, who I think is just brilliant beyond brilliant, fantastic stylist, and if you haven't read his work, you should. buy Pulphead, collection of essays, or Blood Horses, his memoir and history of thoroughbred horse racing. I'll have him back one of these days. Well, Mark was teaching at the University of the South at Sewanee, and Mark had been told, in no uncertain terms, you'll get 12 students in this writing class. Seniors. All seniors. You can't admit anyone else. And just a little bit later, a young student that Mark didn't know came in to talk with him, and they spoke for maybe an hour. At the end of the conversation, Mark went to find the person who had said no more and said, I'll add one more student. It was John Jeremiah Sullivan, who was either a freshman or a sophomore, turned out to be the best writer in the class. Well, that's who's with us. We'll hear more about him in a moment, but the generosity of people like Mark Richard and John Sullivan and Tony Early, others, is something I want all of you in the coming years, as long as you're at Hillsdale, to take advantage of. And so next spring we'll have somebody back again and so forth, as long as we have this program in place. It's a great joy for me to do this work, and a great pleasure to get to know people like Mark Richard and to consider him a friend, though I've only seen him for a total of 3 days in my life. And it's just wonderful to have him back. Well, to introduce him more formally tonight, I've asked a senior English and art major, a very fine writer in his own right, from Atlanta, Georgia, Forrester McClatchy.
Mark Richard, born in Lake Charles, Louisiana, is the author of 2 award-winning short story collections, The Ice at the Bottom of the World and Charity, as well as a best-selling novel, Fish Boy. His short stories have appeared in The New Yorker, Harper's, Esquire, GQ, The Paris Review, and many others. His most recent book, the memoir House of Prayer No. 2, was published in 2011. He's the recipient of the PEN Ernest Hemingway Award, a National Endowment for the Arts Fellowship, a Whiting Foundation Writers Award, a New York Foundation for the Arts Fellowship, a Mary Frances Hobson Medal for the Arts and Letters, and a National Magazine Award for Fiction. Mr. Richard also wrote the screenplay Stop Loss, produced by Paramount, and has been a writer and producer for CBS's Criminal Minds Suspect Behavior, Showtime's Emmy Award-winning series Huff, Chicago Hope, on CBS, and Party of Five on Fox. He's also written and produced for Hell on Wheels on AMC. I hope that those who've read Mark Richard's fiction have enjoyed the rewards of paying close attention to the prosody, the melodies of his prose, his attendance to unique dialects, his deep knowledge of place, and his stylistic bravery make the experience of reading his work harrowing and lovely. Whether tragic, comic, or limning the space in between, his stories order the world a little with each rereading. Please help me welcome Mark Richard.
Is that good? Thank you, Forrester. And thank you, John. It's such a pleasure to be back here, and I feel the same way about you. We have Summeralls in our family, and I think the old name was Somerville and Somervale. We may be distant cousins. I would only hope so. I feel like I was a name dropper when everyone he mentioned go, oh, I know them. I stay at their house. I train their dog. But in the case of Eudora Welty, it was very strange because we had to go through all these machinations to get an interview with her in Jackson. And the man who arranged it was the head of Southern Studies at Ole Miss. And he said, don't stay long. And when the interview is over, you will know it. I said, well, give me a hint. He said, you will know it. So I was there with the producer, and we had a sound guy, And, you know, I was starstruck. I mean, I work with actors, and I won't drop their names because I'm starting to feel self-conscious, but Eudora Welty, man, that's Eudora Welty I'm talking to, and I got a little flummoxed. And I asked her a question, and then at a certain point, she began to levitate, and she just started to, like, float. And she had this big armchair, and it was one of those chairs that if you sit in, you push a button, and it pushes you up into a standing position. But from where we were sitting, she was just starting to float up above us, and I was going, interview must be over now. And it was over. It's a great thing you do, bringing people here. I love so many of those people, especially John Sullivan, who was a trip. It was an honor. I don't know how much I taught him. He was a great student, though. He's gone on to do great work. Dennis Covington. And what I think is unique about those people, and we were speaking about this, John Sullivan said, I'm a leftist and an atheist, so can I still come? And I think Dennis Covington is a person whose most recent book is Revelation in Search of Religion in Violent Societies. I doubt that John Sullivan is an atheist. I can't read his work and believe that's so. But it does point to a question that we spoke to with some of the students today and more recently when I came before. This is a great place and a great college to find out what your belief system is and whether you have one or not. Let me just say this. As a writer, it's good to know a little bit what your belief system is. I mean, Flannery O'Connor certainly knew what her belief system was, and she was able to create great art. I think as a young person, you have an opportunity in this place of higher learning to figure it out, to ask yourself, what is my belief system? You may not have any answers, and that's fine. That's what it's about. But great art is also informed by people who know what they think and know what they believe. So I would just suggest that when he was mentioning these writers that he did, because they're people who are searching. They're people who are questioning what they think. I really don't believe John's an atheist, so when you read his work. I'm going to read a story that I've never read in public. It's a little bit chancy because I'm only going to read one story. Am I ringing, or is that just my deafness? I'm okay. Am I ringing? Okay. That's television talk, I guess. It's like, you know, as long as the camera is on me and it's good, I'm in focus. Look, I got the thumbs up. But I'd like to read the story because I'm fond of it, and I've had some... I've been thinking about this story for reasons that have nothing to do with being here tonight. There's a cadence to it. When someone was asking me today about how you write in first person, third person, the story often determines how you tell the story. And there was a language that this story expressed itself in that I didn't understand at first. So I may stumble through it a little bit at times because I don't understand how the narrator exactly speaks or why he speaks this way, but I have an idea. And I'd like to make just a couple of quick remarks afterwards about how this story came to be, because I think that was instructive to the students today. We did a couple of stories and I said, okay, here's how I wrote the story. I was due the next day for a workshop. Here's how I pulled myself through with the craft of it. We've all been in that place where it's midnight and we have nothing. So this was a story that I'll talk about afterwards. It came to me because I was in a really boring sermon in a Lutheran church because I had, believe it or not, I had a supermodel girlfriend at one time. I know it's really hard to believe, but when we visited her parents on Long Island, we had to go to this Lutheran church, and the sermons were really dry, so I was sort of just kind of like looking at the Bible, you know, while the sermon was going on. And so I'll get into it afterwards, but this is a story called Happiness of the Garden Variety. I felt really bad about what we ended up having to do to Vic's horse Buster today. Not that looking back all this could have been helped. All this starting when Steve Willis and I were ripping the old roof off of where we live in the shanty by the canal on Vic's acres. Vic was up to Norfolk again, checking on a washing machine for his many-childed wife. Steve Willis and I left to rip off the roof and to hammer in new shingles. We were doing this in change for rent. Every month we do something in change for rent from Vic. Last month previous, we strung 3 miles of pound net with bottom weights and cork toppers. What we change for rent usually comes to a lot more than what I'm sure the rent is for our 4-room front porch shanty on the canal out back of Vic's house. But Steve Willis and I like Vic, and Vic lets us use his boat and truck for side business we do on new moon nights. Let me tell you something about what makes what we ended up doing to Vic's horse Buster all the worse. This is not to say about Vic less than Buster. Me, I personally, and I know Steve Willis did too, hated Buster. Steve Willis having had to watch from far away Buster kill 2 of Vic's dogs. There'd be a stomp and a kick of dust and then a splash in the canal where it's a crab feast on Old Tramp or Big Spot. Then there was Buster's biting and kicking of us humans. Buster having bit me on the shoulder once, coming up from behind while I was scraping barnacles from one of Vic's skiffs in change for rent. And then he didn't even move when I came at him with a sharp-sided hoe. Steve Willis had Buster kick in the driver's side of his car door after Buster had been in some weeds Vic had sprayed with the wrong powder. Buster kicked in the door so hard, Steve Willis still has to crawl in from the other way. It was this eating that finally got Buster in the end, though not being able to read the right powder label is something about Vic which made him have us around. This is what I mean, this about Vic and about what we did to his horse to make things all the worse. Vic could not read nor write, and this about Vic affected the way we all were with him. What I mean all means Vic's wife and his children and Buster and his dogs and all the acres we all lived on down by the canal and everything on all those acres and everything on all those acres painted aquamarine blue. Because one thing about Vic, and I say this to show how Steve Willis and I made this all the worse, was that Vic, not reading or writing, seemed to make him not to think about things like they had names that he had to remember by way of thinking that they needed spelling. But instead, Vic seemed to think about things in groups, like, here is a group of things that are my humans. Here is a group of things that are my animals. Here is a group of things that I got for free. Here's a group of things that I got off of good deal making. And here's a group of things that I should keep a long time because I got them from some people who had kept them a long time. And maybe because of a couple of these reasons put together, Vic had another group of things painted aquamarine blue because he had gotten a good deal on 2 55-gallon barrels of aquamarine paint. And everything, even Vic's humans and animals, who could not help but rub up against it or sit in it somewhere because it was everywhere wet. Everything was touched the color of aquamarine, though all of us calling it acarine, because even spelling it out and sounding it out to Vic, it still came out of his mouth that way, acarine. Keeping in mind, here's a man who can't read nor write. And Steve Willis and I always saying it acarine, like Vic said it for fun, because it also always seemed like somehow we were always holding a brush of it somewhere, putting it on something in change for rent. So what made what we did to Buster worse were some ways in Vic's thinking which were brought on by him not reading or writing. And just because somebody had kept Buster a long time to Vic made it seem Buster was very valuable. And even though the horse did come with some history tied to it, the real reason the people had Buster for so long because they were old and they could not seem to kill the horse by just shooting it with birdshot over and over again, even though they tried again and again. Them just making Buster meaner and easier for Vic to buy when the two old people saw him in church and asked him, did he want a good deal on a historical horse? The history that Buster had was he was the last of the horses they used at Wicomico Light Station to run rescue boats into the surf. To Steve Willis and I, when we heard it, we said, so what? But to Vic, this was some history he could understand and appreciate, being an old sailor himself, and it being some facts that he did not have to be gotten from a history book that he could neither read from in the first place. What I came to find out later on was the heart tug Vic felt about this old horse that had to do with when Vic grew up. Vic's father, having boarded a team of surf horses in a part of the house where Vic slept in when he was a boy because all the children from Vic's parents spilled out of the two-room clapboard house laid low in the dunes. Not a far situation from Vic's own children, who as long as Steve Willis and I have lived here, I don't think I've seen all of yet because they keep spilling out of the house barefoot all year around, and maybe it's because there are so many of them that Vic can't seem to remember all their names right, rather than the fact that he can't place in his mind what they are called because he can neither read nor write. Anyway, the point I'm leading to about the heart tug is that where Vic spent his life as a child was sleeping with two other brothers in a hayloft over a team of old surf horses, and a hayloft mostly empty at that, not even because there was no hay to be had on an island of sand, but because the team always grazed on the wild sea oats in the dunes. And this is what makes what we did the worst. This tug on Victor's heart to his younger days that Buster had. Me hearing Vic tell it all to Buster one day when Vic didn't know I did. The feeling Vic remembered best of laying snug with his brothers, all of them laid over each other to keep warm during the winter northeasterns that shook the two-room clapboard and the tacked-on horse stalls where they slept. Remembering them in the early mornings, keeping warm, wishing for breakfast, while down below the horses would be stirring to go out, making droppings, and the smell coming up to the warm, all over each other brothers. The warm smell of wild sea oats passed through the two solid horses, bringing sea fog breath. So that was the heart tug Buster had, and I don't mean to make Vic out strange owing to him liking the smell of an old horse passing gas. I think if you think about it, there's really nothing here that doesn't fit with a man not thinking thoughts he has to read nor write, but fits well with a man who thinks of things as being good when they are human or animal, especially if they came about by getting them for free or from a good deal. I guess that is the main reason about Vic, besides using his boat and truck on new moon nights that Steve Willis and I stuck around. Us and a couple of groups in Vic's mind mainly getting a good deal off of. Us stringing nets, ripping roofs, painting everything, not breathing what we called acarine. And that is also the main reason what we ended up doing up all the worse. So like I said, this started when Steve Willis and I were ripping the old roof off of our 4-room front porch shanty by the canal in change for rent. Vic had gone to Norfolk because he had heard of a good deal some people from church had told him to do with washing machines. And Vic, having stood in water barefoot while plugging his old washer in and getting thrown against the wall by the electric shock, naturally to his mind thought it was broken and in needed of replacing. Vic had left in the morning, coming in to get Steve Willis and I up around dawn to finish the roof, and said only one simple thing, the really easy thing, to please keep Buster out of the garden no matter what we did. Then Vic was off through the gate in his good deal truck he had painted acarine blue one night after supper the week before. It was July hot, and before we started, Steve Willis and I just walked around our shanty roof, just looking, because the island we live on is flat, with just scrub pine and wandering dunes. And from the single story up, you can see Wicomico Light Station, the Inlet Bridge, and the big dunes where the ocean breaks beyond. It was a good morning, knowing Vic's wife would come soon out, bringing us some sticks of fried fish wrapped in brown paper. Her knowing for breakfast we usually had a cigarette and a Dr. Pepper. For a long time, Steve Willis and I had not made any new moon runs to Stumpy Point to make us watch the one lane down to Vic's Acres for cars we wouldn't like the looks of. And I could look at Steve Willis, and Steve Willis could look at me, and we could feel good to be one of Vic's humans in a house on all of Vic's acres. About midway through the morning after their chores, about a half a dozen of Vic's kids came spilling barefoot out of Vic's Acarine blue house to ride the Acarine bicycles and tricycles and to play on the Good Deal Acarine swing set and jungle gym. The older Vic's kids got to play fishing boat and battleship down on the canal dock as long as one of them stayed lookout to keep a count of heads and to watch for snakes. From over my shoulder, I was watching what Buster was up to. He stood looking up at me in the middle of the midday morning hot yard, not seeking shade like even a common ass would, but just standing there in the yard, near where the incline made of Good Deal railway ties came up out of the canal and led up to the boat shed. Buster just stood there, not even slapping his tail at the black flies that were starting to work on Steve Willis and I up on the roof ripping shingles, but standing so still as if knowing not to attract one bit of attention to himself on his way to he and I knew where. I would rip a row of shingles and look over my shoulder, and Buster would be standing perfectly still, not even slapping his tail at the black flies or even showing signs of breath in and out of his big, almost to the ground slouching belly. Just standing as if he was a big kid's toy. Some big kid was moving around in the yard when I wasn't looking, all the time moving closer by 2 or 3 feet at a time to the garden. So I would rip a row and look, never seeing him move, even by an inch. And I saw Steve Willis was not even bothered by looking to keep an eye on Buster out of the garden, even though Vic had told us both to do it. And the reason was simple, for Steve Willis not to care, and it boiled down, and this is it. The evening Vic went over to make the good deal off the old people who had Buster for so long, he rode Buster home. And when he showed up at the gate needing one of us, me or Steve Willis, to come down off the porch of our shanty to open the gate, it was me who came down to let Vic and Buster in the yard. That's the reason for Steve Willis not caring about Buster. Not one more thing. Steve Willis stayed on the porch with his feet up on the railing watching Vic ride Buster by, and me close the gate. And ever since, anything Vic tells us to do or about or with Buster, it is me who does it, or me who listens, even though Vic is telling us both. It is me and not Steve Willis, all from me getting down to open the gate that one time. That is why today Steve Willis was just ripping rows and not looking at Buster sneak. And I tell you, this forward thinking in Steve Willis when we make our new moon runs, I like it then. But around the chores in Vic's back acres, it can become tiresome and make you job shy yourself. Just about lunchtime, just about the time for the little Vic's children to come into the house to get cold pieces of fried fish and Kool-Aid for lunch, the big Vic's children down by the dock all shouted, "Snake!" and ran about fetching nets and poles and paddles. This was a good time for Steve Willis and I to break. So Steve Willis and I broke for a cigarette to watch what would all Vic's kids be telling around the table that night all supper long. Vic's big kids ran up and back the dock trying to catch the snake with their poles and paddles. And the poor snake ran from one side in the boat slip with his escape cut off by one of Vic's big kids poling around in the wash tub, trailing a minnow seine. One of Vic's big girl kids caught the tired out snake on the surface and dipped him out with a canoe paddle. and one of Vic's big boys grabbed it up and snapped it like a bullwhip, popping its neck so it went limp. Vic's dogs, that Buster hadn't yet kicked into the canal, barked and jumped up on the boys playing keep-away with the snake until the boys took it up to the outside sink where we clean fish to skin it out and drive what the dogs didn't eat into the sun. As they all paraded up to the house, I came to notice the yard seemed even emptier than it should have been, with Vic's kids and dogs all gone up to the big house. And then I realized what piece was missing when between the wooden staked rows of pea beans I saw a patch of sparrow-shot ragged horsehair and a big horse behind showing out by the tomatoes. I shouted a couple of times and spun a shingle towards where Buster was at work munching cabbage and cucumbers, but the shingle just skipped off his big horse behind and splashed into the canal. By the time I got down from the roof, leaving Steve Willis up there ripping shingles, Steve Willis not being the one to open that gate the first time Buster came into Vic's Acres, Buster had eaten half the young cabbage heads we had, and I knew better than to come up from behind a horse that could kick a full-grown collie 30 yards. So I picked up the canoe paddle the big Vic's girl had used to fling up the snake on the dock and went through the corn to cut Buster off at the cabbage. But head to head, me shouting and making up and down wild slicing actions with the canoe paddle, Buster had no focus on me. Instead, he was stopped in mid-chew. Then the sides of his almost to the ground slouching belly heaved out, then in, and then more out, moving so much more out that patches of horsehair popped and dropped off. And I took a step backwards halfway, fearing for an explosion. I called for Steve Willis to come down to hurry up, but all Steve Willis said was, "What did I want?" I said, "I think Buster is sick from whatever Vic had sprayed on the cabbage, probably not getting anybody to read the label of what it was to begin with." And then Buster sidestepped like he was drunk through 2 rows of stake-strung pea beans, and then he pitched forward to where I was backing up holding the canoe paddle. Of little good, I was thinking, against an exploding horse. And then Buster, I swear before God, Buster belched and then blew out broken wind loudly at the other end at the exact same time as his knees shook out from under him and he went down among the tallest tomatoes in Vic's garden, wiping out the uneaten cabbage and some cucumbers too. By this time, Steve Willis had come down off the roof to look at the tragedy we were having in Vic's garden. It was hard to count the amount of summer suppers Buster had ruined and smushed. Steve Willis called Buster a son of a bitch for wiping out the tomatoes because Steve Willis's favorite sandwich being tomato with heavy pepper and extra mayonnaise. Steve Willis asked me, did I hit Buster in the head or what with the canoe paddle? But I promised I hadn't given him a lick at all, though we were both looking at how hard I was holding on to the handle. Steve Willis pushed in on Buster's big blowing up belly with his toe, and air started to hiss out of Buster's mouth like a nail-stuck tire, and the fear of explosion having not completely passed, we both gently stepped back. You could tell the little hiss was coming out near where Buster's big black and pink tongue stuck pretty far out of his mouth, laying in the dirt between where the tomatoes were smushed and the cabbage used to be. Steve Willis said, "This is not good." Usually when Steve Willis and I have a problem in our on-the-side new moon business, we say we have to do some big thinking. And we are always seeming to be doing big thinking in all of our business. But since this was a Buster problem, and since Steve Willis didn't come down off the porch that first time to open the gate, it was coming clear to me I would have to be the big thinker on this one. I stepped back to think really big about this tragedy, figuring from where the garden is situated around the boat shed by our shanty on the canal, you can't see it from the big house. So I figured I had a fair while to figure out where to go with Buster after I got him out of the garden, hoping to find a hole big enough nearby for such a big animal, and to do it all the while Vic's little children slept out of the afternoon sun, and while Vic's big children went to afternoon Bible study. In the first part of thinking big, I went up to the garage to get the Good Deal riding lawnmower to yank Buster out until I remembered it had a broken clutch. And when I came back, Steve Willis was holding back a laugh to himself. And I will say this about Steve Willis: he's not one to laugh right in your face. He was holding back a laugh, holding the rope I'd given him to put around Buster to yank him out. Steve Willis asked me what kind of knot would I suggest he tie a dead horse to a broken riding lawnmower with. And I could see how far I could get Steve Willis to help with the Buster tragedy, so I took the line out of his hand and put a timber hitch around one of Buster's hind legs, saying out loud, "A timber hitch seems to work pretty well, thanks a whole hell of a lot." I paid the line out from the garden and started to get that sinking feeling of a jam panic, a panic closing in, needing some very big thinking, and not the July hunt in the hot sun in the yard, baking waves of heat, making me feel any better at all. You get that sinking panic feeling, and I got it so bad that while I was paying out the line across the yard, and even though I knew I could never ever possibly do it, I stopped and held hard to the line, and I gave it a good solid pull, the hardest I could, to yank Buster out of the garden, straining, pulling, even when I saw it was hopeless. And even with the panic worsening, I had to let go of the line, and all the difference I had made was that now there was air hissing out from where the black flies were moving around and settled back beneath Buster's big stringy tail. Well, this was even better than before to Steve Willis, who stepped behind what tall tomatoes were left so he wouldn't have to laugh at me to my face. I picked up a shingle I'd flung at Buster from the road and spun it towards Steve Willis, but it sliced to the right and shattered our side kitchen window. And Steve had to go behind the boat shed to laugh, not in my face this time, after you couldn't hear the glass falling in the shanty anymore. So I gathered up the line, bunched at my feet, and trailed it over to the boat shed down to the dock. Vic's big Harker Island rig, our New Moon boat with the Chrysler inboard, was gassed up with the key rusted in the ignition. I cleated the line that ran across the yard from Buster's hind leg onto the stanchion on the stern and shouted over to Steve Willis in the garden to at least help me throw off the lines. I felt for an instant better, starting up the big deep-throated engine so that the floorboards buzzed my feet, feeling the feeling I get that starts to set in running the rig over to the hidden dock on the South Bay shore on our new moon nights, the feeling of the chance of sudden money, the possibility of anything, even danger and death, and feeling now in a July hot sun the feeling of big thinking a way out of this bad tragedy. With the engine running, it was now possible in my mind that we wouldn't lose our place of life in Vic's acres over something like letting a big horse die. I was feeling better as Steve Willis threw off the stern line, and I choked the wraps on the stanchion, leading to where I could just see two big-legged hooves hung up on the tomatoes, where I could snatch Buster out and decide what to do then. But the sound of the big engine turning over brought out the dogs from underneath the big house, them being used to going out with Vic in the mornings to check 5 miles of pound net. And then some of the older kids, not yet set off for Bible study, started to spill out of the house to see what Steve Willis and I were up to this time with their daddy's boat. And if I looked harder at the house, which I did, I could see little Vic's children in the windows with diapers and old Vic's t-shirts on, wanting to follow the big kids out, but not coming, them having to sleep in away from the afternoon sun. Vic's dogs got down to us first, even old Lizzie's tan and gray snout, a snout she lets babies pull without snapping, and a snout which would, when you were bent over and fooling with getting a lawn hose turned on, come up and give you a friendly goose in your rear end. Even old Lizzie's tan and gray snout snarled back to show ripped, wolf-like teeth when she saw that old bastard of a horse Buster was down. And then she and all of Vic's other dogs were on the carcass, and there was no keeping them away. Now I had the problem of everybody in Vic's acres coming down to see what I had let happen to Buster, topped off by the dogs having their day going after Buster's body, biting his hind legs and ripping away at the ears and the privates. The sight of the dogs on Buster was no less than the sounds they made, blood wild. And here came the rest of the kids to see all this even being better than chasing the water snake around and out of the canal for a supper table story. I had to think quick, so I pulled Steve Willis by his belt into the boat, us starting over at that point about me and him and anything to do with Buster. Forgetting the first time, him not getting down to open the gate, I pushed forward on the throttle, but did it swinging the bow off where I knew the sandbar was, still being in the right mind to know not to double up a dead horse tragedy with bad boatsmanship. When I rounded the dock and the line leading to where the pack of wild-acting animals were in the tomatoes with the horse carcass snug tight, our bow rose and the stern squared, and I gave that big old Lovey Chrysler the gas. And looking over my shoulder, I saw Buster slide from the garden with still the dogs around, this time giving chase to the dragging legs, because in their simple minds, they were probably thinking the only way to stop something with legs is to bite its feet, whether that something is standing on them or not. I knew that I was not just pulling Buster out of the garden now, but that we had him sort of in tow, so that as we turned to the canal proper and Buster skidded across the bulkhead and onto the dock that I knew wouldn't take his weight, I really had to pour the engine on, and I was right. Buster's big body humped the bulkhead over and came down, splintering the dock we had just been tied to. But for an instant, even over the dogs barking and the children yelling and the deep-throated throttle of the engine giving me anything making me feel better about this, just for an instant, I heard Buster's hooves hit and clatter across the good deal planking of the dock before bringing it down. And in that second of hearing horses' hoofs on plank, I had to turn back quick and look, because it passed over me that maybe I would see Buster galloping behind us, giving chase to me and Steve Willis out of Vic's garden, instead of us dragging his big dead body out to sea in tow. We still had plenty of canal to cover before we broke out into the open ocean. The dogs raced along beside us on the bank of the canal as far as they could, but it was a game to them now. Their wolf-like leaps mellowed out into a tongue-flapping lopes. A couple of the neighbors on down the canal came out to watch, and the wake and spray from Buster cutting along ass backwards threw water into their yards. One of the cousins, Malcolm, was working in a boat, and seeing us coming, he held up a pair of water skis, pointing to Buster, laughing as we passed. But I could see open ocean, so I throttled down and leaned hard forward to balance against the rising bow. I was glad I had enough forward thinking of my own to pull Steve Willis into the boat, starting us over about Buster, because I could look at him in the stern watching the big horse carcass we had in tow by a stiffed up leg, and looking at Steve Willis, I could see it was sinking in on him that when Vic came home from Norfolk and threw me out of the back acres by the canal, it would be Steve Willis himself being thrown out too. I burned up about 3 hours of fuel looking for the right place to cut Buster loose. One problem we had was one time we stopped to idle the engine and pull up the floorboard so I could check the oil. And while we set to drifting, Steve Willis noticed that Buster floated. You could tell how the body was like a barrel just below the surface, that it was the air or the gas or whatever was in Buster's big belly keeping him afloat. When I got up from checking the oil, I threw to where Steve Willis was standing in the stern a marlin spike, and he looked down at the spike, and then he looked up to me like he was saying, "Oh no, I'm not going to punch a hole." And I looked back at him wiping the oil off of my hands, looking back like, "Oh yes, you will punch a hole." And when it came time for me to cut Buster loose out near the number 9 Sea Buoy, and it came time for Steve Willis to punch a hole, I did, and he did, and it was done. So here we are, really feeling bad about what finally ended up doing to Vic's horse Buster, us drinking about it in the first flight lounge. After we called Vic's wife at home and she said, nuh-uh, to the sideways questions we asked her about Vic being home yet, trying to feel out how bad was the tragedy, and her hanging up not saying goodbye, and us wondering did she always do that, and then us realizing we'd never talked to her on the telephone before. After we tied up Vic's rig in the ditch behind the first flight lounge, we started to wonder if shouldn't we have let Buster had his say about what to do with his finally dead horse. So therein started us having the lack of forward thinking and of big thinking, and instead we were left to second guessing, and after we had left the rig with its better feeling hum and came in to drink with the drink buzzes coming on ourselves, we started to feel naked in our thinking, especially when a neighbor of Vic's came in and shook his head when he saw us and then walked back out. So what Steve Willis and I have done is to get down off the wall the tide chart and figure out where the most likely place for Buster to wash in is. We'll head over there when the tide turns and wait for Buster to come in on the surf and then drag him up to take him home in a truck we'll somehow big think our way to fetch by morning. The tide tonight turns around 2:30, just about when the lounge closes too. So that is when we think we will make our move to the beach in front of the Holiday Inn, where it's where we expect Buster back. So Steve Willis and I sit in the first flight lounge, not having the energy to begin to think about where we are to live after having to get ready to be kicked out of Vic's Acres, much less having the energy to big think about pulling a sea-bloated horse out of the surf at 2:30 in the morning. Here we are sitting, not having the energy to big think about all of this, when Vic walks in barefooted and says, "Gentlemen, gentlemen," another one of the ways he says things because he can't read nor write and doesn't know how things are spelled to speak them correct. There's a nervous way people who don't drink, say preachers, act in bars, but that is not Vic. Vic sits at our table open-armed and stares at all the faces in the place, square in the eye, including our own we turn down. He sits at the table that is for drinking like it could be a table for anything else. Vic says he saw his rig tied up in the ditch behind the lounge on the way home from Norfolk. Would we want to ride home and come get it in the morning? Steve Willis and I settle up and stand to go out with Vic, who says he's excited about the good deal he's come back with. Looking at Steve Willis, I see it's to me to start telling Vic about us having to wait for his favorite animal and his animal group to wash up down the beach, all at our hands. Out in the back of Vic's truck, Vic runs his hands over the 6 coin washing machines, something he does to all his new good deal things to make them really his own. Vic says he got them from a business that was closing down. Won't his wife be happy? Vic says our next change for rent will be to rewire the machines so they can run without putting in quarters. What did we think? I start to tell Vic about Buster and the tragedy in the garden. I can't see Vic in the dark when they turn off the front lights to the first flight lounge, but I can hear him say, as I talk. When I finish the part with Steve Willis and I waiting for the tide to turn, Vic says, "Come on, boys, we ought to get on home, oughtn't we?" All 3 of us sit up front of the truck riding across the causeway bridges home. All Vic says for a while is, "Well, my horse, my old horse," not finishing the rest if there is anything to finish. And I get the feeling Vic is rearranging groups in his mind, like his animal group things and his human group things and his good deal off of people things, and maybe a new group of really awful people things with just me and Steve Willis in it. But then Vic starts talking about how, in change for rent, Steve Willis and I are also going to build a laundry platform with a cement foundation and a pine rafter shedding. And Vic starts to talk like even after taking rearrangement of all his things and all his groups, everything still comes up okay. Vic says, "Oughtn't we lay the foundation around the downside of the shanty where Steve Willis and I live so the soap water can drain directly into the canal? And after we figure out how to put the sidings and braces up, oughtn't we put a couple of coats of paint on it to keep the weather out, maybe in change for some rent? And what color would us boys say would look good?" And Steve Willis and I both sit forward and yell, "Acarine!" At the same time, us all laughing and me feeling happy, crossing the last Causeway Bridge home. I'm happy heading there as a human in Vic's acres again. I don't know about that story. I don't know about that story. It's a long story, but I will have to say, as an ambitious young writer reading through the Old Testament, I was always thinking I would write stories based on biblical tales. So that's my version of the story of the garden and Adam and Eve. And I read a story when I was here last time called Gentleman's Agreement, which was about Abraham and Isaac. I've written a couple more. Yeah, that's what my 12-year-old says at the end of a sentence. Yeah, it's like he doesn't know how to proceed after that. But thank you for letting me read that. I don't really read it often, and I thought maybe if you had any questions, I know we're nearing on the 9 o'clock hour. If anybody had any questions or anything they want to talk about, John or class. Yes, ma'am.
Love way moved from Genesis to redemption.
What? I can't hear.
Somebody pass that up to me. Love the way he moves from Genesis to redemption. It goes from the Old Testament right to the New. She says she loves the verse. She says she loves the way he moved from Genesis to redemption.
Well, thank you. I'm so deaf. All right, thank you. But that was also to the people I met this afternoon for workshop. Remember we were talking about the congestion and how if you need to learn how to, if you need to figure out a place to go, just repeat where you've been a little bit to give you a little bit of leverage and springboard. That story was full of it, even though I kind of, and sadly, the story is semi-autobiographical, and it was a terrible day. It's just like one of those really bad days. Yeah. Anybody else? Yes, ma'am.
So when you're creating characterization, creating a character, I guess what's the importance and place of detail, like how much, you know what I mean?
How much detail to give the characters in describing them?
And how small does the detail need to be? Well, I guess what goes into creating a fully developed character?
That's a good question. For example, in this story, it was less important to talk about Vic in his physical description. It was more important to talk about Vic as what he sees in his worldview, because that was the only crucial part. Steve Willis, we don't even know what he looks like. We can guess because they're outdoors all the time and they're both on the water. Just enough would be my answer to that. And let the reader, I always think that the reader is an intelligent reader who fills in the blanks. So I'll lead them on and let them fill in the rest and let them have the aesthetic pleasure of helping me color in the canvas. John?
You write for television. When you're writing for television, how conscious are you of how you want your characters to appear?
You have to stick to generic types, because when it comes to casting, you don't know what you're going to get, and you may get someone who is just wildly different than the description that's in the script. So you go, Eric, 30s, handsome. What you don't say, and we talked about this, so much bad television is written by white males and middle-aged white males who are often lazy in their descriptions, and it translates into a laziness throughout the script. And it's fraudulent, dishonest writing sometimes when they go, and the example I used was just a couple of weeks ago. I saw it in a script. Cindy, description, Cindy, hot but doesn't know it. Now, let me tell you, a white male middle-aged guy wrote that. If Cindy's hot, she knows it, you know. Let's just start with that. It's lazy writing. And it even goes into developing the character. The other example we used is, okay, we got to make this woman tragic. This just happened the week before last. What does a white male go? They go, oh, she's got a rape in her history. And I'm thinking, you know what? I know a lot of women who are tragic that haven't been raped. Can we do something else? Can we just think harder? Can we write harder for these characters? So yeah, as they say, lazy writing makes me crazy. Just makes me crazy. But I don't get too specific in the detail unless it's a character who is one of the lead characters. And then sometimes you're surprised. You would never have thought this actor for this role, and they come and nail it. So you try to be a little bit loose or open. Somebody's asking me over here. Is there a hand? Yes, sir.
Back to what you said about the story determining the narration. What about happiness of the garden variety requires a first person?
What about it requires first person? I think it's almost in the tradition of the Southern story where it's such, and we talked about this a little bit. There are times when circumstances are so unbelievable that you have to work yourself up to it. I can't tell Vic that we poisoned your horse and we drug him out to sea all in one breath. It's almost like, and I can't tell an audience member that. But if I work slowly and it's an I and I need to pull you by your lapel and intimate something to you, go, look, man, this is where we lived. These are the people we lived with. This was in their constellation of things. We're not bad people. We're not all good people. This is what happened. So I think that the first person was, for me, a way to get intimate with the reader for something that was hard to believe. I mean, like I say, whether it happened or not is insignificant, but I knew I was going to write about this one day. And I knew I had to come into it in a very personal, imagine this story told in a very high speech. It wouldn't have worked. You know, a high third person, and the young men who, you know, had a living smuggling dope and also were, you know, then the horse expired, unfortunately, eating the cabbage. Contrary to advice, a rope using a timber hitch was secured to the horse's rear leg. You know, it's not like I'm not drawing you in. It's just reportage. And the first person allows me to tell you, I feel bad about this, man. I was complicit. I'm the villain. I feel bad about this. And I'm hoping by showing that my culpability, that you have some sympathy for my plight, even if it's unearned, and that I didn't mean to do it. This was just like somebody going, I didn't mean to eat the apple. I had to do some big thinking in that apple, and I ate it, and I did this thing, and I was going to get kicked out of the garden, and I lied, and I told the truth, but I was accepted, and God had his open arms, and all that stuff. The great thing about modeling short stories on myth or parables is that it gives you a structure, and if it doesn't work, toss it out. But I wrote all these stories in a workshop, and often they were written late at night when they were due, a couple of days before they were due. I was bartending, I'd write them at the bar. And that gives you kind of an immediacy, but they become confessional. A lot of these stories are kind of confessional, which was fun. So, I don't want to keep, yes, sir.
So I'm wondering, from that story and House of Prayer number 2, you know, there's less dialogue than normal, and it's all in first person.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that's not at all like television writing. So,
Yeah, another good, and I had a question about that today. I'm from old school where, well, it's not old school, it's a different school where I believe in told dialogue because I feel like that's genuine. When I read lines of dialogue in a book, I'm feeling a distance between that, that immediacy that I covet with the writer. Now the writer's going, and here's what people said. I'm going, dude, you were just leading me by my lapel and you're throwing all this up. I don't know what I'm supposed to think. You told me before, so-and-so said this and that, and I'm thinking, that's important dialogue because you said they said it. But when you're throwing up the dialogue in those lines, I don't know. Now you got to make me think. You're supposed to be seducing me. You're supposed to be leading me. You're supposed to be revealing this. That's in fiction. In TV, you don't get the luxury of that. It is dialogue driven. And especially because we're watching so much of it on tablets now, you're not seeing as much. It's just the dialogue is pushing the story forward. That was a hard thing for me to learn, was how to get story moving with dialogue and not be Aaron Sorkin, who writes so much. I mean, it's brilliant, but not a lot of television is like that. But you learn it. I think television is a craft that you can learn. To me, it's really hard. I have a hard time with it. My scripts can be ponderous, and it's easier for me to work on someone else's show where I can just say, well, I know they said that and they said this, and do some tricks. But it's a whole different style of writing. It's been good. It's been healthy for me as a writer to learn that type of dialogue. But I will not put dialogue in my work. It's just not my style. So I don't want to keep you because it's 9 o'clock. I'm going to hang out, though, and if anybody has a question, I'm happy to hang out and talk. But again, thank you all for coming, and I hope you liked that story. I had a couple other things I was going to read that I'd read last time. One, never read that, so thank you for bearing with me on that. Thank you.